Good morning, Year 11, and welcome today to your screencast for Conflict and Tension, where we're going to look at the Manchuria crisis. So, the Manchuria crisis was where Japan invaded Manchuria in 1931. So my keyboard's not working there. So, in 1931, so Japan invades Manchuria in 1931, and they mainly do this for a number of reasons, but the main reason you need to know is the Great Depression. It has a huge economic impact, a negative impact on Japan, and they decide that a really easy way to get natural resources, which Manchuria was really rich in, by the way, was to invade Manchuria, which at the time was part of China and owned by Chinese warlords. Now, straight away, this was negative for the League of Nations, and it was negative for the League of Nations, and we can almost see exactly the same reasons why the Ruhr crisis was negative for the League of Nations in the 1920s. Manchuria was negative for the League of Nations in 1930s because the League of Nations looked pretty powerless because one of their own assembly members was starting war when their aim was to stop war. And I think even more significant was the fact that a member of the council, someone that was supposed to uphold the League of Nations law above all others, one of the strongest nations, again, had started this war. So it wasn't just the fact that the League of Nations were failing to stop war, it was the fact that a member was actively starting a war, and not actually for a justifiable reason either, which kind of might have been allowed to be explained away. There's just no justification for doing this apart from the good of their own nation. So, what did the League of Nations do next then? Well, the League of Nations issued, they tried to talk to Japan, and then they tried to mitigate, and then they issued moral condemnation to Japan, which Japan then ignored. Again, showing the League of Nations to be really weak because half of the covenant can be ignored. The League of Nations then sent a man called Lord Lytton to Japan to investigate, and when he investigated, he wrote the Lytton Report, which blamed Japan for the invasion of Manchuria. However, the Lytton Report was 6 months. It took 6 months for Lord Lytton to write it and for it to go to the League of Nations. And this just really emphasised how slow the League of Nations was in dealing with issues. So if we think back to that structure, remember, they meet every year, and this is just an example of the fact that the League of Nations was just too slow in dealing with things. And the League of Nations then continued, and the members of the League of Nations continued to trade with Japan because they knew Japan would just trade with America anyway, so there was no point in them losing out money, especially during the Depression when it wouldn't have an impact on Japan. And I think this is really significant because we've seen moral condemnation fail, we've seen mitigation fail, and now we see the economic sanctions fail, and we know they don't have a military, so Japan would have no reason not to stop invading Manchuria. So like I've just said, the mitigation, moral condemnation, money and military, the covenant was completely useless here, and they'd completely failed to stop Japan, sorry. And a really common cartoon is the Trial of Geneva, which we can see here, and there's lots to analyse here. So just at the top we can see the League of Nations. Okay, they're supposed to be a peacekeeping organisation. We can see that by the birds. We can see a number of people, lawyers, looking at the Lytton Report, and I think this is really a criticism. Does it really need that many people and that big a report to come to the conclusion that Japan were at fault when we all know that Japan invaded China, and everyone knew at the time Japan invaded China? I think as well we can see here the fact that the league just weren't respected. We can see that because we've got all the judges there, and we've got Italy. I keep saying Italy, sorry. Japan with its machine gun sticking its its little finger and its thumb up at the league, kind of saying, you can do nothing. Hey, And again, showing the League to be weak, showing that the Permanent Court of International Justice had no real impact. It was just kind of could only give advice. So really, really highlighting how weak the League of Nations was. And you can see that just in the words below. It says the judge says the court orders you to respect the law and sentences you to a good talking to. So again, quite funny. You've got to listen to the law, and you're going to get a good talking to now because of this. And then Japan, and it says all Japan, not just a little bit, but all of Japan say, and I order the court to mind its own business, and I sentence it to go and chase itself. So basically, you're absolutely useless. And this is really significant because even though we've had elements before where the League of Nations has failed to really stop war in the 1920s, it was kind of balanced out by the positives. So if we think about the Corfu crisis and we think about the Ruhr crisis, it was balanced out by the positives of the special commissions. It was balanced out by the positive of the Ireland Island crisis and the Bulgaria crisis. But here we don't have anything to balance it out. So it does raise tension with a lot of different nations. But having said that, it's really interesting because, on the other hand, there was quite a lot of public perception at the time that even though they'd failed in Japan, this was actually okay because it was so far away from Europe. So the public of Britain, for example, they were okay with this because ultimately they felt that if the League of Nations, if something was to happen, if war was to happen, it would be stopped in Europe. So again, kind of showing that not only was the League of Nations not meant for the whole world, it was very European centric, very European centered. So if we're talking about how it delivers tension to other nations, we could definitely say it delivers tension to the League of Nations. It's a massive failure, but actually to the European public, it doesn't have that much of an impact in terms of tension, just because they believe that if it was in Europe, it would be stopped. Quite not an immature and a little bit of a silly view to take, an inexperienced view to take. And I think as well, if we're thinking about how this creates even further tension, we can definitely link this to Hitler and Mussolini. More so Mussolini, because Hitler isn't necessarily, he's not Chancellor in 1931, so he's just a German politician, but he will have been watching this. And Mussolini, who was leader of Italy, he was definitely watching this. And they both see the fact that the League of Nations don't do anything, Britain and France as individuals don't do anything, and it really inspires them to move forwards. Hitler with kind of his rearmament, his conscription, and Mussolini with his invasion of Abyssinia in 1935. So above all then, the Manchuria crisis has a significant impact, especially in the long term, on other nations and on the League of Nations. But in terms of the public opinion at the time, especially European people, it wasn't seen as a massive negative. So there's definitely some balances there in it causing a little bit of tension for some and a lot of tension for others. And remember to split into those groups if you get a question on Manchuria.